Hi, I'm Lena, and welcome to Super Data JP, the channel where we turn Japan's real estate and cost of living numbers into answers you can actually use. Every video here is built on verified government data, not opinions, and not guesses. Whether you're planning to invest, relocate, or just curious what life in Japan really costs, you're in the right place. Let's get into today's numbers.
A tenant stops paying rent. Most first-time landlords assume they can just change the locks within a few days once the money stops showing up, the same way it might work back home. In Japan, acting on that assumption alone can get the landlord sued, and the actual legal process to remove someone takes months, sometimes well over a year, no matter how clearly the tenant is in the wrong. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of owning rental property in Japan, and it catches foreign landlords off guard more than almost any other rule we've covered on this channel, usually right after their first non-paying tenant. This is for anyone who owns, or is considering buying, a rental property in Japan, and wants to know exactly what happens, step by step, when a tenant stops paying, well before it actually happens to them. So why can't a landlord just remove a non-paying tenant immediately? The answer starts with a single piece of legislation. Japan's Act on Land and Building Leases requires a landlord to have legitimate grounds, known as seito jiyu, before ending a lease or refusing renewal. Simply wanting the tenant gone, needing the unit back for family, or even having a better offer on the table isn't enough on its own. Courts weigh those landlord-side reasons against how much the tenant would actually be harmed by losing their home. That means a landlord cannot legally change the locks, enter the unit without permission, or remove a tenant's belongings without a court order backing it up, no matter how many months of rent are actually owed, and no matter how obviously in the right the landlord feels. Doing any of that anyway is called self-help eviction, jiryoku kyusai, and it's illegal in Japan. It can expose the landlord to criminal liability of their own, on top of a civil lawsuit from the very tenant they were trying to remove. Courts have historically sided with tenants in these cases even when the rent really was unpaid. So what does the actual legal path look like, from the first missed payment to getting the unit back? It starts with direct demands for payment, typically a soft first contact around week 1, then a firmer written notice around week 2 if the rent still hasn't shown up. If the tenant still hasn't paid by around month 1, the landlord contacts the guarantor or guarantor company directly and demands the outstanding rent from them instead. This step alone resolves plenty of cases before they ever reach a courtroom. If that fails too, the landlord sends a formal lease termination notice by certified mail, typically around month 3 to 6 of continuous non-payment. That 3-month mark isn't arbitrary. Courts generally treat roughly 3 consecutive months of unpaid rent as proof the relationship of trust between landlord and tenant has genuinely broken down, which is what unlocks termination. If the tenant still won't leave after that notice, the landlord files an eviction lawsuit, typically 1 to 2 months after the termination notice was sent. From there, it's in the court's hands. A straightforward, undisputed case where the tenant doesn't even show up can resolve in a couple of hearings, roughly a month or 2 apart. A contested one, where the tenant fights back with their own lawyer, disputes the amount owed, or claims hardship, can drag on for several additional hearings before a judgment is finally handed down. Added up and simply reaching the point of filing typically takes 5 to 7 months from the first missed payment, and the full process, judgment included, commonly runs 6 months to a year and a half. Winning the judgment still isn't the finish line, either. If the tenant simply ignores it, the landlord has to separately petition the court for forced execution. Once that's approved, the court sends the tenant a formal vacate notice within about 2 weeks, with the actual execution date landing roughly 6 weeks after the petition was filed. On that day, a court bailiff, not the landlord, physically removes the tenant's remaining belongings, catalogs and stores them in a warehouse for a set period in case the tenant claims them, and changes the locks, all under judicial authority the landlord never legally had on their own at any point, no matter how many months of unpaid rent had piled up. None of this is free, either. Here's roughly what the full process costs, stacked step by step. Certified mail for the termination notice, about 1,300 yen, genuinely the cheapest line item in the entire process. Court filing fees run around 80,000 yen, covering the stamp duty and required postage for the lawsuit itself. Forced execution costs roughly 300,000 yen, including a court deposit of about 65,000 yen plus the bailiff and moving crew fees on the day itself. Legal fees are the biggest single line item by far, roughly 500,000 yen to 700,000 yen for a typical case, split between an upfront retainer and a success fee of 10 to 20% of whatever back rent the lawyer actually manages to recover. All in, landlords commonly spend close to 1.0 million yen getting a single non-paying tenant out through the full legal process. Legally, the landlord can bill the tenant for every one of these costs afterward. Practically, a tenant who couldn't manage rent for months rarely has the money to reimburse a 5- or 6-figure legal bill on top of it either. Most of this cost simply sticks to the landlord. There's a faster, cheaper path some landlords use instead, a court-mediated instant settlement, Seketsu Wakai, that skips a full trial entirely once both sides basically agree the tenant should leave, while still giving the final agreement the same enforcement power as a judgment, without nearly as much time, or nearly as much legal spend, though it still requires the tenant's cooperation to work at all. For a completely different scenario, landlord-initiated eviction, like clearing a building for redevelopment, courts and negotiations typically expect a relocation payment worth 6 months to a full 12 months of rent. That payment isn't legally mandatory in every single case, but offering a fair one meaningfully improves both the odds a tenant agrees to leave voluntarily, and how favorably a court views the landlord's position if the case ends up in front of a judge anyway. Here's the twist this whole video has been building toward: all of this legal protection runs in one direction only. Getting a tenant out is nearly impossible. Getting accepted as a tenant in the first place is a genuinely different story. Industry survey data shows 22% of foreign renters in Japan report being turned down for a lease, and the single most common reason cited was simply being foreign. That's despite a government guideline stating nationality-based refusal counts as unjust discrimination, and at least one court case awarding roughly 1.1 million yen in damages over exactly that kind of refusal. As a landlord, screen tenants carefully before signing, because removing a bad one afterward is slow and expensive. As a renter, know that nationality-based rejection isn't just unfair, it's documented as unlawful, and it's worth pushing back on. Japan's rental law was built to protect tenants from arbitrary removal, and it does that job almost too well. The trade-off is a system that rewards landlords who screen hard up front, because there's no fast exit once someone's already in. Subscribe for more data-driven breakdowns of living and investing in Japan, and let us know what part of Japanese landlord-tenant law you want covered next.
And that's today's breakdown. If you're serious about real estate or moving to Japan, research like this is exactly what separates a smart decision from an expensive mistake. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, and drop a comment if there's a city or word you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.